Hi everyone, welcome to another video. This will be hopefully a quick video because we're just going to touch on a part of equations, and we've looked in the past about solving a bunch of different types of equations, and in this video we are mainly looking at something called restrictions on variables. So cases for when we have an equation, certain values that variables cannot be. Now, just for the first couple examples, we're just going to revise how to make something the subject of an equation and manipulate these types of equations here. So I'm including the first one here. This will be quite familiar to a lot of you. This is the equation of a line. Now, let's say I wanted to make x the subject. So remember, what we mean by the subject of an equation is having the thing on its own on one side equaling everything else on the other side. So here we want to essentially isolate the x on this right hand side. We want to strip everything around it away, get it onto the other side of the equal sign, or in other words, the other side of the equation. So first what we're going to do is we notice that first the m is multiplying by x and then the b is added at the end. So we're going to subtract b here. That's going to get us closer and closer to x. Now, because we're subtracting b from both sides, I'm going to get that y minus b on the left hand side equals to m multiplied by x. And because the m is multiplying by x, to undo this and get x on its own, we want to divide by m. Divide both sides by m to get our x on its own on the right hand side. So finally, I'm going to get y minus b all divided by m equals to x. So we have isolated the x, we have made it the subject of the equation. We have it on its own, equaling to everything else on the other side. Let's try one more, and then we're going to look at restricting some variables. So we have this particular equation here, y squared equals to a squared plus b squared. Okay, and here we want to make a the subject of the equation. So we want to get everything on this right-hand side away from the a, get everything on the left-hand side. So we isolate it here. Okay, so we can see that b squared is being added to this a. So I'm going to subtract b squared from both sides, and that is going to leave me with a squared on its own on the right here. So I will get y squared minus b squared on the left equals to a squared on the right. Okay, now I have a squared, a to the power of 2. So this isn't a yet. This is a times a on the right hand side because we're squaring a here. But we've learned a lot of the times in past videos that to undo the squaring of a number, we can take the square root of both sides. When we take the square root, we get a on its own on the right hand side. And when we solve these types of equations with a power of 2 in them, we can get two answers. We can get plus or minus y squared minus b squared. This is the same as, for example, when we have a squared equals to 4, then we take the square root of both sides. That'll give me a equals positive or negative 2. This is because since we're squaring a number, we're timesing it by itself. Positive 2 times positive 2 gives me a positive 4. And negative 2 times negative 2 also gives me a positive 4. So that is why we have this plus minus thing here. But this may change when we look at restricting variables, which is what we're going to do now. So in example 3, we're going to consider this equation y equals to ab squared. And we want to ask ourselves, are there any restrictions on A, B, or Y? So in other words, can these values be any number? Well, it can, because Y, well, if we substitute in a positive, we can substitute in a positive or negative number for A. We can substitute in any positive, any negative number for B, and that's going to give us a whole bunch of different values for Y. So at the moment, there are no restrictions on these variables. So I'm going to write here for part A, so currently, in the equation's current form, there are no restrictions on our variables. Cool, that's relatively straightforward. But let's look at what happens when we have restrictions. So in this second part, we're going to rearrange to make B the subject of the equation, and we're going to assume that B is greater than or equal to 0. So B can be 0 or any number bigger than 0. So let's go about rearranging this equation here. I'm going to write it again underneath here. I have y equals to a times b squared. And I want to strip away everything from the right-hand side to get b on its own. Now currently a is getting multiplied by b squared, so we can undo the multiplication of a by dividing by a. That's going to get us to b squared on its own. So I want to divide both sides by a. So I get y over a on the left-hand side equals to b squared. And once again, like we did in the previous example, I can undo the squaring by taking the square root of both sides. So therefore, I'm going to get that b is equal to plus or minus y over a. But here in the previous example, we said that when we take the square root of a number, we can get positive or negative. But we're given a restriction on the variable of b. We're saying here that b can either be 0 or a number greater than 0. So therefore, this negative option we are going to ignore because of the restriction on the variable b. So therefore, b can only equal to the positive case of y over a. Now, I've written it like this. I can also write it explicitly with a positive there. And we can say that b equals to the square root of y over a because of this restriction, since b is greater than or equal to 0. So all numbers that are greater than or equal to 0 are positive numbers. So we can't get the negative case here. Okay, so let's look at one more example from this particular equation. Now it's just going to take me a second to write this out, but we're going to ask ourselves, if y is greater than 0, are there any further restrictions? Any further restrictions on a after making b the subject? And if this is so, we want to explain why. Now, let's look at this current equation with b being the subject. I have that b equals to y over a. Now, this is saying if y equals to 0. So we're assuming here that a particular restriction has been made on y. So y is a number that's greater than 0. Or in other words, y is a positive number. Now, how does that affect a? Well, if y is a number greater than 0, what would happen if a was a negative number? So let's say, for example, that y can be any number greater than 0. Let's say it was 3. And what happens if a is a negative number? Well, let's try negative 3 here. So inside this square root, I get 3 divided by negative 3. Now, when I divide a positive number by a negative number, I'm going to get a negative answer. But can I have a negative number inside a square root? No, I cannot. You can try this in your calculator. If you put the square root of 3 over negative 3, or the square root of negative 1, it will come up with math error. You won't be able to find this. So a can't be a negative number, because that would always result in a positive divided by a negative. Anytime a positive gets divided by a negative, we're going to get a negative answer, which means a negative number inside my square root, which we can't have. It's not going to give us a proper answer. So one thing we're going to note down is that a can't be negative. This is one particular restriction that arises when we restrict y to just be bigger than 0. For y just being bigger than 0, it has an effect on a as well. But if a is a positive number, it will work because we're going to have a positive divided by a positive, which gives us a positive number in the square root sign, which will give us a real answer. If you put that in your calculator, it's going to work. So that's one particular restriction. And we're saying a can be a positive number. Can a be 0? What happens if a equals to 0? Well, if a equals to 0 and y is a number greater than 0, that's going to be some number getting divided by 0. Can we actually divide by 0? Well, no. Once again, you're going to get a math error if you do this in your calculator. So if you had, for example, 4, the square root of 4 divided by 0, this is going to give you a math error. This will not work. So not only can a not be negative, a also cannot be 0. So let's write that down. So a can't be negative and a can't be 0. So let's write out our restriction here. So if y is greater than 0, there is a restriction on a when we make b the subject. So we can say, therefore, writing this as an inequality, making this restriction of y is greater than 0, that leads to a restriction in the a. So yes, there will be a restriction in a. A will have to be, if we write this as an inequality, greater than 0. So a can be any number that is bigger than 0. This is what we mean by restrictions. These cases where one value can only be something, how does that affect the remaining values? And it affects it in different ways depending on whether we have a square root or a denominator or some kind of other restriction. So for example here, when b is positive, we assume b is greater than 0. How does that affect equations and the values the equations can take if these restrictions are applied? That brings us to the end of today's video. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next time.